We're ready to resume. I'd like to welcome...
We're missing a witness.
I know, he's on his way though. I welcome the representatives of the Cost-Benefit Analysis and Review of Regulation panel of experts. For the Hansard record, could you each please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? Mr Pearce.
David Pearce. I'm Executive Director of the Centre for International Economics. I'm appearing as a representative of the CIE as the principal subcontractor working with the cost-benefit panel.
Thank you.
My name's Tony Shaw. I'm a consultant these days, and I'm appearing as a member of the panel.
Thank you.
Very modest.
Henry Irgash. I'm appearing as a member of the panel.
Thank you.
Damien White. I was the head of the Secretariat of the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr White. Would any of you or each of you like to make a brief opening statement?
Thank you, Chair.
Professor Irgash.
Simply to record the apologies of the chair of our panel, Dr Vertigan, and of the other member, Ms Alison Deeds, who are unable to attend today. We've provided 3 reports which have been made available. Happy to summarise those, but otherwise, should that not be needed, obviously ready to address any questions that you or the other members of your committee might have.
Thank you. It might be useful, just because we do have people watching today via the Parliament House website, for you just to give a very brief description of each of the reports, please.
There are 3 reports that have now all been released. The first report responds to the terms of reference relevant to a statutory review of the Competition and Consumer Act 2010. That's the Section 152 EOA review. And the essence of that review is to examine and make recommendations in respect of those sections of the Competition and Consumer Act that broadly go to the regulatory arrangements. The second report that has been released is Volume 1 of our Market and Regulatory Report, and that addresses the future market structure and governance arrangements for broadband services. And the third and final report, which has been released as Volume 2 of the Market and Regulatory Report, examines the costs and benefits of high-speed broadband.
Thank you very much. Senator Conroy.
Thanks. I'm just wondering, while I'm familiar with Mr Shaw and Mr Irgash, Mr Pearce, I'm not as familiar with you. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of your background.
Certainly, Senator. As I said, I'm Executive Director of the Centre for International Economics. I've worked there for about the last 25 years. I'm an applied economist. Our firm does commissioned economic research for a wide variety of organisations, including Commonwealth and state governments. We were engaged by the Department of Communications to assist the panel in their work. We have a period contract with the Department of Communications, and in this particular job we responded to a tender. My personal background is in various forms of quantitative economic analysis, benefit cost analysis, economic modelling, statistical work, and my work personally is across a wide variety of areas. We do a lot of work on RISs, regulatory impact statements, cost-benefit analyses for governments and private organisations, so large projects and so forth. And so our role, as I say, in this particular project was to assist the panel in undertaking the calculations and developing the model that lay behind the benefit cost work.
Great, thank you. Mr Shaw, for those who haven't been lucky enough to be familiar with you, would you want to give us a quick précis of your background?
I've been involved in one way or another in communications regulation since 1987. and was involved in the reviews and the early acts leading up to the 1997 Act, which I led the team that put the 1997 legislation in place. I was then appointed to the chair of the Australian Communications Authority, a position I held until 2003, and since then I've just been a freelance consultant working basically for myself or with companies where it's been sensible to do so. I've also been engaged by governments in various roles, including the assessment of the tenders for the fibre to the node proposals by originally the coalition government and then subsequently the Labor government.
I think Mr Ergas is well known to us all, but I just wanted to clarify, and I'm indebted to the great Jarl Arkvark for doing a little bit of research on you, Mr Ergas. It's his moniker on Whirlpool. So I just wanted to confirm that you're the Mr Ergas referred to in this, so that there's no confusion. So it was a appearance before, or a decision that you appeared before, and I want to make sure it's you, in AAT, I think it was, but I'm happy to be corrected. The evidence said Mr Ergas appeared reluctant to respond to questions whose answers might have been adverse to the case put by the party calling him. Mr Ergas provided non-responsive answers and deviated to discussions of other issues which supported the case of the applicants. Such an attitude and conduct of an expert witness leads us to a conclusion of partiality, and an inability to express an objective expert opinion upon a reliance can be placed. And it concluded, and there's quite a few other paragraphs, but I can put them on the record if anyone wants, but it concludes by saying, we have little confidence in the methodology used by Mr Ergas to quantify the public benefits claimed by the applicants, and accordingly we were not persuaded by the estimated figures he ultimately reached for each category. And Mr Ergas's calculations appear to be predicated upon unstated assumptions and suppositions rather than on precisely spelled out inputs. That's you, isn't it? It's not another Mr Ergas that's been wandering around?
Yes, well,
no, these are by a judge, so
sorry.
I just want to make sure it is you.
I've appeared in 52 cases. If you wish, I'll record what was said about me in the remaining cases that you haven't cited. But yes, that case, however, is not in the AAT, it's in the Australian Competition Tribunal.
Oh, sorry, the ACT rather than the AAT. Thank you for that. Now, while you're here, I thought, Professor Ergas, are you able to table the tax policy that Malcolm Turnbull hired you to produce when he was leader of the opposition? Are you in a position you could do that for us?
It's entirely irrelevant to this.
I just thought it might be helpful.
Hearing.
I suspect it is not directly relevant.
Well, because Malcolm Turnbull's never released it, so I was just wondering if Professor Ergas had a chance to put his name up.
Senator, if I could
Conroy.
just comment on that in this respect. First of all, I wasn't hired by Malcolm Turnbull.
That's right, you volunteered.
I'm sorry?
You volunteered, I think.
No, that's incorrect. I was asked by Malcolm Turnbull whether I and others would participate in a tax review. That tax review prepared an issues paper for Mr Turnbull. That issue paper is with Mr Turnbull. It is Mr Turnbull's decision.
No, fair enough, but he's never released
whether
it.
he releases it or not, or in what form he uses it.
So, but he's never released it publicly yet, has he?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
So you must be getting used to having Mr Turnbull dump your reviews before they've even been published, given that he said no to almost everything that's been recommended before he actually even released this review. Sort of a bit of a pattern there.
I don't believe that's a reasonable summary of the
I'm just reading the media commentary on it.
I don't believe that's a reasonable summary of the government's response to our review, and the recommendations are not, in any event, my recommendations. They're the recommendations of the panel. The government has indicated that it is considering those recommendations. There's a very large number of recommendations, and obviously we'll see what the outcomes of that review will bring.
I thought I saw Mr Turnbull in headlines being quoted as he's ruled out all but about one of the recommendations. That was all. I'm happy to be corrected.
So I don't know exactly how many recommendations there are, but there's a large number of recommendations in the 3 reports, and I suspect that many of those recommendations will indeed be implemented, but obviously government has to consider them as governments generally do with reports of this kind.
Okay, now before we just move on to the CBA, I'd like to ask a few questions on recommendations 6 and 7 in the NBN Market Regulatory Report released on Wednesday. And just to be clear, your recommendation here is that NBN Co should pass on the cost of rolling out fibre in new developments to developers, and your expectation is that that cost will be passed on to homeowners. Is that an accurate description of that recommendation?
No, it's not really an accurate description of our recommendation. What our recommendation is to change the approach that NBN Co is taking to the recovery of the costs associated with deploying in greenfields estates. Essentially, at the moment, what NBN Co has been doing is to not charge at the moment at which it provides the infrastructure, but then to recover the costs of the infrastructure over time, and to, where that cost recovery is not sufficient, to obviously transfer the burden onto other consumers. What we've proposed here is to do what was done under the terms of the Competition Principles Agreements under the Hawke and Keating governments in respect of other utilities, and for telecom, as it then was, and then Telstra also at that time, which was to move the initial connection charges and charges for linking up premises to network where that involved additional work, moving those to be cost reflective, and doing that so that when decisions were being taken about where to locate developments, those costs would be taken into account. As I say, that is what was done really as part of the competition reform process, the Hilmer process. For other utilities, it was done for telecom. We propose that it be done here, but that it be done subject to ACCC review of those charges.
I'm tragically drawn back to the transcript I read out before. On page 19, it states quite clearly that the burden of bearing the initial costs would fall on developers, although ultimately those costs would be capitalised into property prices. That's
Exactly.
quite a straightforward statement, which I just asked you to confirm, and you've spoken for about 2 minutes without remotely addressing the statement in your own document. So can I ask, did the panel assess the impact of this recommendation on house prices in particular markets?
Well, the impact on house prices is very much as you suggest, that broadly what will happen, we expect, is that those charges will be partially reflected in housing prices and partially capitalised into the price of the land, and to that extent they will be borne by the initial landowners.
Okay, thanks. So you didn't do any assessment of how this would impact in any particular area?
No.
Why not? Was that sort of outside the remit? Not interested?
No, because what we were doing, and obviously my colleague on the panel, who was also obviously involved in this a recommendation, may wish to add to it, but clearly what we were seeking to achieve was that charges should reflect costs, that they should do so in a transparent way, and that they should do so consistently with the approach that emerged from the Hilmer reforms.
One of the difficulties, Senator, in having a situation where there is no charge for connections It's not that those costs aren't being recouped from somewhere in the system, they are. And in the current case, NBN Co would be obliged to recoup those costs through its cross-subsidy arrangements, which means that potentially low-income users in areas where there were high profit margins would effectively be paying for those costs. Another concern of the panels was that without some form of charging by NBN Co, the commercial operators who are providing services and who wish to continue to provide services in new estates effectively will not have a market, because developers will just turn to NBN Co because they're not charging. And it seemed to us that in accordance with the agreed competition principles, policy principles, that it was preferable to have a competitively neutral approach in that market, so that the NBN Co and commercial providers could compete on their merits.
Yes, and indeed the Productivity Commission's Office of Competitive Neutrality had found NBN Co's policy in this respect to be a breach of the competitive neutrality principles of the competition principles agreement that the Commonwealth had entered into. And so what our recommendations seek to do is to rectify that breach while still providing a high level of protection for consumers through the requirement that charges be subject to regulatory review.
No, I'm very familiar, probably very proud of the fact that I breached a bit of right-wing economic ideology quite deliberately, and the government's policy was quite deliberately to breach that deeply flawed piece of ideological
The deeply flawed
rat-baggery.
piece of ideology that was spelt out by Prime Minister Keating in 1995 in a speech on the merits of competitive neutrality?
Deeply flawed.
Deeply flawed. Excellent.
Now, before I begin in detail, on page 139, the CBA states, and I quote, "In our review of the strategic model, we identified some corrections to be made to formulas. We note that these changes had a relatively minor impact on the results of the model. The department was questioned at estimates in May on instances where errors in formulas can result in incorrect results. The purpose of those questions was to ask whether the underlying model for the CBA would be available for scrutiny." So can you explain why the CBA should be relied on when the data and calculations are hidden from view? I mean, that's one of the problems we have in trying to make an assessment.
Well, of course, you will be intimately familiar with this, given the level of disclosure that attended the documents that were prepared for the NBN implementation plan, where none of the underlying workings were released. But the essence of it was that what we did, together with the CIE and advisors, but broadly what we did was to go through the calculations that had been made as systematically as possible. And in part because circumstances had moved on since those calculations were made, but also perhaps because of the fact that some of the calculations were made for the NBN strategic review, which was undertaken within very tight timeframes. We did find some anomalies, and we corrected those anomalies. We sought from NBN.
How long did the strategic review take?
I think the strategic review took 3 months, but we did seek from NBN Co permission to make fully available all the underlying cost data. Unfortunately, NBN Co was not in a position to agree to that, and as a result, where we did not have NBN Co's permission to make data available, we obviously could not do so.
And Senator, I might just add that, if we had the ability, we would like to have the benefit cost analysis, its model, and all the underlying cost data available to everybody. But unfortunately,
I was just asking why.
Unfortunately, for commercial and confidence reasons, the only information that we have that is contained in our report is all the material that we could get agreement to release. The material that hasn't been released was not our decision, it was somebody else's on commercial and confidence grounds.
Now, can I just check my maths is right? 3 months is 12 weeks. It's not a trick question. I'm just checking. 13 weeks. I'll happily accept 13 weeks. Now, the CBA states on page 137 that the key cost and timeframe inputs for the MTM and FTTP scenario in the CBA is the models prepared by NBN Co for the strategic review. Am I correct in saying the scenarios selected for the CBA out of the strategic review were scenarios 6 and 2? So 6 is MTM and 2 is radically redesigned FTTP.
Yes.
Now, the CBA states that the panel independently reviewed NBN Co's costs and timing assumptions feeding into these scenarios. That review process is set out in Appendix F, and every number in Appendix F is redacted. So, just to go to the point you made, Mr. Shaw, who requested the data to be redacted?
That was
NBN Co.
NBN Co. This material was prepared by the panel and its consultants, and the material that has been redacted has been done so because NBN Co. have claimed confidentiality over those numbers.
Was the Secretary of the Department consulted on the decision to redact this information?
I'm not sure what the situation was within the department, but I imagine that the senior officers there were consulted, yes.
Okay. Now, the 4 primary assumptions that you've made are set out on page 138. Do these 4 assumptions constitute the bulk of any variation between NBN Co modelling and the panel's modelling?
.138 and the top of 139, yes.
Okay. Were any of these revised assumptions discussed with NBN Co before their incorporation into the CBA?
Yes.
Are we able to get any copies of correspondence or minutes of meetings around that issue?
No, because the discussions were, essentially telephone conversations with NBN Co and with NBN Co's consultants. And then on the basis of those, the panel obviously had to come to a view as to what it thought was sensible and reasonable in the circumstances.
Were any of these revised assumptions discussed with the Minister's Office before incorporation into the CBA? And the Minister's Office meaning both the Minister and his staff?
Not that I know of.
Not that I know of, Senator either.
Yeah, you just got to say, they can't see the nod of your head, Mr.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Hansard just had to record the...
Sorry, certainly not to my knowledge.
Okay. Now, the Minister and the NBN Co have relied upon the strategic review, and you've substantially, and the board of NBN Co, you've substantially revised the numbers in the strategic review. Is the expert panel advising us that there are errors in the strategic review?
Well, there were, as I explained a moment ago, there were some minor anomalies that we identified in the details of the spreadsheets. So, for instance, without being able to go into the details of the calculations, there were situations which looked rather similar in terms of the activities that they were costing, but where the cost estimates diverged very markedly. And in those cases, it emerged that effectively there had been really errors made in completing the spreadsheets. Those
I couldn't be convinced Mr. Rousselot made those sorts of substantive errors, but keep going.
Well, as we say, we don't think those errors were enormous in terms of their impacts, and in any event, they certainly didn't alter the overall results. And as you'll know, and as we document in the report, a very broad range of sensitivity tests were undertaken, and it did not alter our results materially, whether you used the initial estimates as prepared by the strategic review or the estimates that we came to in the light of working through the modelling that had been done.
Okay. Before we discuss the assumptions, beginning with productivity factors, you note in Appendix F, and I quote, the strategic review assumed very substantial productivity gains during the NBN construction phase for all technologies. These were particularly high for FTTP, incorporating large productivity gains that were in addition to the efficiencies achievable from the radically redesigned network. So I think that's a direct quote. So before we discuss the assumptions the panel made in regard to productivity gains, I'd like to confirm exactly what the panel means when it's talking about productivity gains versus efficiency gains. Help us out here for the non-economists. Could you please describe these two elements? Mr. Pearce?
I think, Senator, they're effectively the same thing as far as common usage is concerned. They're productivity gains in essentially factors reducing the costs over time of deployment of the technologies, and there were assumptions in the NBN Co models and assumptions that have been retained in the models as we've used them, which say that these costs go down over time. Effectively, it's cost reduction, productivity improvement, efficiency increase, and common usage.
No, I just wanted to make sure
thing.
that it was roughly the same thing. So I didn't want to get into an argument saying, no, I meant something different. So thank you very much for that. So do efficiency and productivity gains result in a cheaper network that is quicker to deploy? That is, efficiency gains affect the build speed as well as the cost?
I think in the models, the efficiency, as we used them, the efficiency improvements didn't affect the timing.
So even if they made the rollout faster, you didn't think that affected the timing? As in the end?
No, so we didn't make the timing. So if we reduced efficiencies, for example, we didn't make the timing slower compared with what it was as set out in the strategic review. We used the same timing.
Okay, so I'm confused here, so please bear with me. So if you came to the conclusion that efficiency and productivity gains resulted in a cheaper network, you then didn't factor that into the deployment schedule timing end date?
No, we use the same deployment schedule as in the strategic review. How can you separate them out? I mean, if they introduced better digging equipment, if they introduced smaller cable sizes that made it easier to shove them down pipes, they're cost savings, but they would also, on most reasonable assessments, suggest you've got a faster build as well. So in our change in assumptions, we reduced some of these productivity factors. So that would imply...
Right, we'll get to that, but I'm just trying to understand that why if you actually get productivity gains, that you don't think you're able to do a job faster. You just save money, but you don't go any faster.
Sure, but we were working in the opposite direction. So our assumption is a very conservative assumption. So we've reduced the productivity gains, but we haven't slowed up deployment.
I think you'll probably find that's not right, but we'll come to that. You said that the productivity gains assumed for scenario 2 in the strategic review were very substantial. So you've made that comment. It's in inverted commas. What does this mean exactly? What do you exactly mean when you say substantial productivity gains?
I think, Senator, you'll find that that's a part of the report that's been redacted in the sense that the numbers...
Surely you can give us a rough description.
Well, significant. They're very significant over the life of the project.
Okay. So despite that, you still assumed... So does that mean that the strategic review assumed a substantially quicker rollout for scenario 2 relative to a scenario where no productivity gains were assumed?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Well, I'm trying to understand. I'm accepting the point you've made, but now I'm trying to understand the strategic review's thinking and align it with your thinking. So the strategic review, which you've looked at and examined and all the details underneath, assumed what you've described as very substantial productivity gains. And we've just discussed that. So I'm assuming, or I'm trying to understand, whether the strategic review assumed a substantially quicker rollout relative to a rollout where there were no productivity gains. In other words, I'm putting the cost savings and the rollout faster savings together and saying did the strategic review assume a faster rollout because of those substantial productivity gains?
Having not been involved in the strategic review, I don't think we could address that question, Senator. And as Mr Pearce said, that essentially our work was involved in examining the productivity gains that were assumed in the strategic review against what information was available to us from overseas experience and international benchmarking. And the conclusion we reached was that they potentially could be still very substantial, but perhaps not quite as substantial as had been assumed, and there was some adjustments that were done to reflect that view. As Mr Pearce said, we didn't then turn around and increase the timing under which a fibre to the premises model or rollout might occur.
Yeah, no,
and indeed, we preferred to leave it as it was.
Yeah, no, I'd call that an anomaly, but we'll come back to that.
We did do a sensitivity test where we modified the rollout schedules. So we did look at that. The problem you have really is that what's happening in the productivity modelling is basically that costs are falling over time along a deployment path, and that's really what's modelled in the strategic review. But when you change the deployment rate, you may have impacts above and beyond those that are captured by the cost modelling that was done for the strategic review. For instance, if you try to accelerate the deployment rate, then costs may rise quite rapidly as you do so, as you run into different constraints. For instance, the OSS, BSS that NBN Co has developed is only capable of handling a particular rate of deployment. If you tried to go beyond that rate, you would incur rapidly rising costs. We did look at accelerating the rate of deployment in the scenarios and in the sensitivity tests. It didn't materially alter the rankings. It didn't alter the rankings at all of the outcomes we came to.
Thanks for that. Now, is the panel aware that the revised outlook in the strategic review incorporated, and I quote, productivity improvements and efficiency savings of 2.5% in FY17 and FY18 only? In other words, virtually no efficiency and productivity improvements at all. So that was the panel's, the strategic review's assumption. You're familiar with that?
Is that the revised review, Senator?
The revised outlook. So that's option one if you want to give it.
Is that the most recent one, Senator?
No, this is a strategic review that was released. It had 6 options, and in option number 1, it advised that there were productivity improvements and efficiency savings of 2.5% in only 2 years of a 10-year build. So I'm just asking whether you were familiar with that one. You may have just said, no, we only looked at 2 and 6, and therefore whatever was in 1 and we didn't look at it. A fair enough answer. But I just wanted to know whether or not anyone had noted that. People all seem to be shaking their heads just for Hansard.
Well, we certainly read the strategic review, and I don't know what the point you're making is, Senator.
No, I was just asking if you'd seen it. I haven't made a point yet.
We certainly read the strategic review, but what we worked off were the models that were used for those particular scenarios that we examined in detail.
No, so I was just asking if you're aware of it. I wasn't making any particular point. I just wanted to know whether you're aware of it. So is the panel aware of the rollout completion date for the revised outlook in the strategic review? That's option 1 rather than option 2 and option 6.
I'm sorry, when you say, are we aware of it, I'm not quite sure exactly what you mean. When we undertook this exercise, we looked at the strategic review very carefully. And so in that sense, anything that was in the strategic review, we would have been aware of at the time of undertaking the modelling.
I'm genuinely not trying to play catch-it. I just want to know whether you're relatively... If I go on to ask some questions about it, it's a waste of time if you say, no, I don't know what was in it, that's all.
Well, but Senator, we have, in a sense, used the data from the strategic review for the cost-benefit analysis. So the timing and other issues, I think, and Mr Pearce might correct me, were just taken from the NBN co-models.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I guess we worked closely with the NBN co-models. Once we had obtained agreement from NBN co to use those models, that's what we used and that's what we focused on then to construct the particular scenarios for the panel's report.
Okay. So my point is the panel aware of the rollout completion date for the revised outlook in the strategic review? To save time, it's 2024. Is the panel aware of the rollout completion date for scenario 2 assumed in the strategic review? I'm assuming that one you do, and it's calendar year 2023. Does that sound familiar?
Sounds familiar.
That's on Exhibit 4.3 of page 98, if there's anyone who wants to check. So the strategic review conferred on the radically redesigned scenario only an extremely marginal deployment benefit of 6 months. So what you've all described as extremely, what was it you said? Very substantial productivity gains, according to the analysis done by the strategic review, essentially meant only a 6 month difference to the deployment. So I just wanted to see if anyone was conscious of that. And to be put in its context, the option 1, known as the revised outlook, has virtually 0 productivity and efficiency gains and completes in 2024. And what you've described as very substantial efficiency and productivity gains that are recorded in number 2, the radically redesigned, only gains a deployment benefit of 6 months. So I just wanted to make sure that if you're aware of that.
Well,
does that ring a bell? Does that seem familiar? I don't want to be accused of verbaling you or putting words in.
Well, Senator, we were, as indicated before, we were essentially focused very clearly on the models, the NBN co-models that were used in the cost-benefit analysis. There was no need for us to go beyond that and look at other issues.
No, because you've used them. So
we've used the models as the data as has been provided to us.
You've been prepared to make changes when you thought there was changes needed. So the issue the question mark that I have in my head is you've said that the productivity benefits in the strategic review for scenario 2 were very substantial. And then the panel goes on to say that you guys say these efficiency benefits are very substantial, but they only result in the NBN model of a 6 month deployment benefit. Very substantial productivity gains, only a 6 month gain.
Well,
and you've just signed up to it.
But that's really, I think the question you're raising is really a question you should put to NBN Co, which undertook the strategic review.
No,
because...
No, but you've used their data. You've used their model. You've used their end dates.
And
you can't say it's them.
No,
you had to exercise independent judgment.
Might be allowed to answer the question, Senator Conroy.
But the essence of it is that, as I was trying to explain a moment ago, when you vary the deployment rate, that will in itself shift costs. If you try to accelerate the deployment rate, then accelerating the deployment rate can lead to a situation where the marginal costs of deployment rise very rapidly. As a result, even if the overall cost curve is shifting down over time, that doesn't mean that your scope to accelerate the rate of deployment is rising at anywhere near the same rate.
Yeah, but you bring forward revenue at the same time. Even you'd have to concede. Mr. Ergas.
Absolutely, but the question is whether the revenue gain is commensurate with the rate at which your costs rise as you try to deploy more quickly.
No, fair question. That's why I would have thought experts like you were engaged. But I'll move on. The result of the panel's review of these productivity gains was, quote, the panel considered that the productivity gains for all technologies were very ambitious, and as a result conducted an analysis using an alternative set of productivity factors that are more consistent with international estimates of nationwide network deployment. Could you just spell those out for the committee? Mr. Pearce, Mr. Shaw, Mr. Ergas?
Spell what out for the committee?
The panel's review of the productivity gains were, quote, so I'm reading a quote from you.
Yes.
The panel considered that the productivity gains for all technologies were very ambitious, and as a result conducted an analysis using an alternative set of productivity factors that are more consistent with international estimates of nationwide deployment. I think that comes to Mr. Pearce's point that you actually decided to use more conservative estimates and assumptions. So I'm asking you to spell out what your alternative set of productivity factors were.
Well, what we did was we looked at the rates of cost decline that were implied in the strategic review modelling, and we also looked at the implied initial cost levels and the implied final cost levels, and then looked at international experience with a primary focus on the experience in Europe and estimates of deployment costs in Europe and the experience to date in New Zealand. And on the basis of examining that experience, we used or adopted revised productivity factors, which still led to quite substantial productivity gains, but which differed somewhat from those used by NBN Co.
Yeah.
So in the context
from very
of,
to quite, so very substantial to quite substantial is what you
well,
categorise that as.
To put that in context, we and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but we assumed that the costs of deployment of fibre would decline by about a third over the deployment period. So they went well below the costs assumed from the initial radical redesign. We also assumed that there would be productivity gains in the multi-technology mix for both FTTP and for FTTN, though we constrained the FTTN productivity growth so that costs would not fall below a benchmark level. So in other words, we put a floor under the costs that would be reached in the FTTN scenario.
Now, chart 4.3 on page 45 sets out the panel's assumptions about the rollout timeframe of each scenario. Am I correct in concluding that the rollout end date for the FTTP scenario, number 2, radically redesigned, has been pushed back 1 year to calendar year 2024 as a result of your review? Am I reading that wrong?
I think it's 2023, Senator.
2023.
It could be just we're reading it incorrectly.
Yes, I don't know.
It's just the scales, I think.
So help me out here.
Well,
it'd be nice if we weren't guessing.
In the modelling, it's 2023. I don't know whether in the plotting, as it were, of the table, that was varied somehow, but in the modelling, the deployment scenario is that which was used for the strategic review.
So you believe that even though it might be compressed in terms of the size of the page it's on, it actually
Exactly.
is not 2024, it's 2023.
Correct.
Okay. So if I could just... We're on page 98. It's scenario 2, radically redesigned, calendar year 23. And on the graph, looking to check the line on the graph against MTM, it looks like it's been shifted back. So can you help me out here? What's your...
What page are you referring to?
I'm on exhibit 4.3. But now I'm talking about the graph, so there's I think what you're referring to before. I'm asking for you to check probably the graph which you were looking at earlier.
In broadly, Senator, there was in the reference scenarios, that is, the scenarios that were used as the main modelling, though we did vary deployment schedules somewhat in both directions in the sensitivity tests. In the main modelling, the deployment schedules are those...
Speak up a little bit. You were looking down there, so we couldn't quite hear what you were saying.
Sorry, I was looking at the graph. But in the deployment, in the main modelling, the deployment schedules are identical to those that were used in the strategic review. So anything that looks like a variance relative to that is simply the result of the plotting.
Okay, so in the sensitivity analysis, you did change the end dates in both directions, one for MTM and...
Yes, we did look at quicker and slower rollout.
Okay. The rollout end date for the MTM is assumed to be static at CY 2020, calendar year 2020?
Sorry, in the sensitivity testing?
No, sorry, in just the main modelling now?
Yes.
Were you provided with the detail of NBN Co's implementation schedule for MTM that was redacted in the strategic review? I know you said you tried to get access to information. Yes. You didn't get access to all of it, but were you able to get access to that?
Well, that was part of the model. I mean, we did have their estimates of deployment rates.
Okay. We were able to assess whether the NBN Co was on track for the implementation of MTM at the moment?
No, we didn't seek to do so, and it would have, for obvious reasons, given that our assessment came almost immediately after the strategic review, it would have been very difficult to do so.
So 9 months later after the strategic review, still no Telstra agreement, still no access to the copper network. Would you be confident that the 2020 date can be reached?
Well, by international standards, I don't think the 2020 date is particularly unusual.
But that was based on a start date of at least the beginning of the year.
And obviously, what the deployment rate turns out to be will also depend on the agreements that are ultimately reached.
But the point is, on the deployment schedule that would have started on X date, we're now 9 months later, or 7 months later, I don't mind which it is, and it could be another 3 or 4 months, it could be tomorrow. So I'm just trying to understand, given the importance of revenue being earlier in the organisation's remit, receiving that money early, the net present value of it, I've heard it all expounded. Do you still believe, in the real world, not your theoretical building world, that 2020 is on track, that a deployment can be squeezed into the remaining period of time from whenever
Well, this is not an
the
issue
build
that
starts.
This is not an issue that we, as a panel, assessed in the sense that the inputs that we used in that respect came from NBN Co and really from the Strategic Review and NBN Co's board's assessment of the Strategic Review. But if you want my personal assessment of that, I think it should be capable of being achieved, amongst other things.
So they
deploying.
can go faster in a shorter period of time to meet a deadline, and there's none of those other problems of going faster in a deployment that you identified in other builds.
Well, as I said, it very much depends on the agreements they reach and the way they structure those agreements. But broadly, FTTN deployment and HFC upgrade are much more readily achieved than having to provide fibre to every premise, which requires far more work and much greater number of truckloads, and so it's more difficult to accelerate.
So even though you were aware that the access to the copper network wasn't available based on your calendar year forecast, you just stuck with them anyway? Like the ducts are available for FTTP, so I can understand why you didn't want to perhaps tamper with them given using the model. They're already available, but the copper network's not available, but you decided, let's just ignore that. We'll assume that they can meet the 2020 deadline.
Well, as I said, Senator, international experience is that deploying FTTN and upgrading HFC can be done far more readily and in a more predictable way than deploying FTTP. And the experience with FTTP to date, including NBN Co's experience, has been a substantial variance between initial aggressive planned deployment and actual outturns. As a result, if you had to make a judgment about confidence, you would say it is much easier to have confidence in the timing of an ultimate FTTN HFC upgrade deployment than in that of a ubiquitous FTTP deployment.
I'll introduce some people at Verizon. No, I just wanted
I've spoken to
go
Verizon,
back. Yes,
and Verizon has had exactly the same experience as has AT&T.
It goes like this. It's exactly what happens. Now, just to be clear, I just want to confirm. I think you've already said this, okay? But I just want to confirm that your FTTP scenario in the CBA, the main analysis, is completed by calendar year 2023, and not as it appears in that graph at 2024, or in chart 4.3 on page 45.
We made in the modelling, we did not alter the deployment schedule relative to that came from NBN Co. And so the start and end dates are the same as those that were used for the strategic review.
Okay. So even though it looks like, this could genuinely just be the way it looks. So categoric, it's
the strategic
calendar
review.
year.
It's the strategic review.
Sorry, I've actually almost finished that off. Now, evidence has been given to this committee by NBN that the fibre rollout is getting quicker. Mr. Adcock stated that at the last hearing. Are the panel familiar with that evidence and testimony?
I'm not, Senator, no.
Is the panel aware of the cost and efficiency improvements in the fibre build currently being rolled out by NBN Co and stated by the CEO, Mr. Morrow, across the country? Things like small footprint multiports, small diameter cable?
I'm sorry,
Familiar with
Senator,
those?
we used the radical redesign as the basis for the modelling. The changes that you're describing form part of the radical redesign.
And Senator, to the extent that there has been information that's come to light since the cost estimates on which we built this cost-benefit analysis is based, then clearly that can have an effect. But in undertaking any such analysis, you have to essentially freeze time and take a snapshot, if you like, of the costs and benefits at that point of time. So in undertaking this work, we've essentially taken what the NBN Co strategic plan produced.
No, except I just wanted to know whether you're...
And to the extent that there are changes in a year or 2 years, then the model could...
Or 6 months.
Could be rerun, potentially to and be adjusted to reflect.
And while
those
I'm sure
changes.
you would rather not bother reading anything more about NBN in the short term, given your deep diving you've been doing in it recently, are you familiar with the finding of what's referred to now as the Melton 10 trial, where they rolled out FTTP 61% faster than existing FSAMs in Ballarat and Victoria?
Well, Senator, on that...
I'm just asking whether you were aware of it first.
Yes, that's been reported. I haven't seen the detailed results of that trial, and I don't believe any of my colleagues have, but there's a couple of points that are worth making. The first point that's worth making is that, as I've emphasised, we have used as the basis for our modelling the radical redesign. That involves very significant cost reductions. Now, we've tempered the rate at which those cost reductions are achieved. We've front-loaded some of those cost reductions, as we note in the text. Okay? But in discussion with NBN Co, we came to a plausible view of what that trajectory was going to be. The second point that's worth making is that all of the experience to date, when you look at NBN Co's cost data and deployment data, suggests relatively high variance between areas. As a result, it's very dangerous to look at a single area and draw any conclusions from that as to what's likely to happen in the network as a whole.
I've actually visited Melton. I suspect you probably haven't, Professor Ergas, so
no, indeed,
I have an advantage over you.
One of many, undoubtedly. But
now,
and the third point is that obviously in the scenarios, in the sensitivity testing, we did examine what effect there would be if you accelerated the growth rate of productivity relative to what we assumed in the reference case.
No, you can always, wish away a faster deployment by saying just assume that the costs would become out of control. It's very easy to make sure your sensitivity analysis doesn't actually lead to a cheaper rollout or faster rollout if you put in a countervailing assumption because it might upset your predetermined outcome.
Well,
so I accept your point entirely. If you put in a countervailing proposition that trying to scale up would lead to unmanageable blowouts in costs, of course it wouldn't add up, would it?
No. I mean, Senator, the discussion in the document is very clear that in 98% of the scenarios that we examined, I think it's 98, is it? 98% of the scenarios that we examined, the results are essentially unchanged. To get a result that has fibre to the premise, combined obviously with fixed wireless and satellite in regional areas, to get a result that says that that leads to higher net benefits, you need to have a large combination of implausible assumptions.
Oh, in your view?
In our modelling. Our modelling.
You described earlier that radically redesigned option 2 has very substantial productivity gains.
Yes.
Then you said your assumptions that you introduced, and there's assumptions, more than one type of assumption, reduced it to quite substantial.
Yes.
How would you characterise a 61% improvement in rollout deployment speed? Is that quite substantially substantial? Or is that just in the very substantial or the quite substantial? A 61% improvement in rollout?
If you look at the strategic,
Don't interrupt the witness.
I'm just wondering whether you could actually tell Professor Ergas whether the information that you're asking him to comment on has been verified.
No, it's the actual time of the rollout is not disputed, other than by a few days.
Senator Ruston, you're
Please.
out of order interrupting the witness.
Other than by maybe a few days, and we're waiting to hear
Order
back on
interrupting
that.
the witness.
The rollout of...
I've called Senator Conroy's
Okay, that's not
attention to
disputed.
that through the course of the
if
hearing.
you look at the material that was provided in the strategic review and in the work that was done on the costings in the strategic review, what's clear is that there are significant variances on an area-by-area basis. And as a result, trying to generalise from a single area to the national picture is, in my view at least, extremely hazardous. Until those results have been replicated in different contexts and the causative factors involved have been carefully assessed, I would say it's anecdotal.
Anecdotal, it started on day X and finished on day Y, and the amount of time was X times Y or X plus Y. That's just anecdotal, is it?
All I'm saying, Senator,
This
is
is an
that
estimate.
you
This is what
cannot
happened in the ground.
generalise from a single instance to the network as a whole. What was involved in the work done by the strategic review was a careful assessment for thousands of distribution areas of what was involved in deployment. That assessment was carefully tested by internal experts in NBN Co and by the external experts that they consulted.
I didn't know you were present at the writing of the strategic review.
There are others, Senator.
Anyway, I'll pause there. I'm sure Senator Ruston would like
Senator
to ask a
Ruston.
few questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I just come back to a bit of a more overall picture? I'm assuming that much of the activity that sits behind your cost-benefit analysis would be based on international experience. I mean, have you benchmarked this against other international communication rollout programs?
Yes. We've looked at international experience both in terms of the overall strategy being pursued and in terms of the costs that resulted from those strategies.
So in your summation, what would your view be in terms of what was previously proposed, the original FTTP program? How does that compare with the international examples against which you sought to compare?
Well, there's very little on an international scale that looks like the approach that was previously adopted. Indeed, there isn't terribly much on the international scale that looks exactly like what we're trying to do at the moment, either, in the sense that in both cases there's a very high level of ambition. There's an attempt to realise that ambition in the context of a structurally separated, essentially new start entity, which is not the result of nor connected to a previous incumbent, hence does not have access to the accumulated expertise and resources of an incumbent. And there's the very substantial investment of taxpayers' money, so that taxpayers are bearing the essence of the risk. And in each of those respects, what was being attempted was really without international parallel.
Okay, thank you. One of the recommendations that's obviously got a reasonable amount of coverage that you made in your report was in relation to the telecommunications regulator and your suggestion that it should no longer be the ACCC. Can you explain, for my basic understanding, what was the premise behind? Why was that recommendation made? What were your concerns?
Well, it's useful to note, Senator, that there's, with the exception of New Zealand, no other jurisdiction internationally has quite the institutional structure that we have for regulating telecommunications, in the sense that what we did was we, subsequent to the abolition of Austal, or as part of abolishing Austal, which was the telecommunications-specific regulator that came out of the 1991 reforms, we rolled the responsibility for telecommunications into the Competition Authority, that is the ACCC, along with ultimately some responsibility for regulating other infrastructure industries, though that regulation is obviously shared between the Commonwealth and the states. And when the decision was made in 1996 to locate responsibility for telecommunications in the competition regulator, a significant component in the reasoning at the time was that we were ultimately going to move away from having sector-specific economic regulation of telecommunications to relying very largely, if not entirely, on the economy-wide provisions of what became Part 3A, or the National Access Regime, in the then Trade Practices Act, now Competition and Consumer Act. So there was essentially the expectation that over time the telecommunications-specific elements would fall away, and what the ACCC would broadly be regulating was it would be using an economy-wide instrument, which was the instrument defined by Part 3A of the Act. Now, that has not proven to be the case. On the contrary, telecommunications regulation, in the sense of the sector-specific regulatory arrangements, have become more substantial, and indeed in our review we recommend a number of changes which would enhance the responsibilities of the telecommunications regulator. We think it's important that telecommunications regulation be, to the greatest extent possible, implemented in a manner consistent with the regulation of other infrastructure. And so we do think that there is considerable merit in having a regulator that covers more than telecommunications alone, but that also has responsibility, for instance, for assets such as electricity transmission and distribution. That's important because it allows you to take a common approach to issues such as that of setting the regulated rate of return, defining regulatory depreciation, and so on. So we see considerable merit in combining the regulation of underlying network infrastructure in a single entity. But we believe at the same time that that entity should be entirely focused on that task, and hence have clear accountability for that task, and have a senior leadership that is focused on ensuring that that task is properly done. As a result, we recommend that really the German approach be adopted of having a networks regulator which includes responsibility for telecommunications and, as you may have noticed, quite independently of us, the current review of the competition laws being done by the committee chaired by Dr. Harper has come to the same recommendation.
In taking that one step further, I noted in one of the principles, the recommendations out of your report was that regardless of disaggregation, you think that the regulatory market needs to be sort of adjusted to better support competition. Do you see by the establishment of a network type regulator as opposed to the broader ACCC type regulation, there's any capacity to be able to to actually streamline and reduce the regulatory burden that's put on some of these instrumentalities in terms of delivering their outcome? I mean, is there a positive regulatory outcome able to be achieved through this?
Well, we would certainly hope so, and we would hope that one of the first things a new regulatory structure would do is examine the opportunities for undertaking that streamlining, for instance, by adopting a truly common approach to issues such as the measurement of the regulated asset base, the way price caps are designed, the monitoring of price caps, the way rates of return are set and varied, and the broad reporting against the various obligations in terms of service quality that are imposed on regulated entities. At the moment, we have really quite different approaches in different areas, and there are opportunities for greater consistency, which in turn should support some streamlining.
Okay.
If I could just add to that, Senator, it's unlikely that the actual regulation itself would change. It's the administration of the regulation and the efficiency with which that's done that would change. Yeah. And as Professor Ergas has just indicated, it's the efficiency gains that come through that process that would be captured in reduced costs of regulation, and at the moment those costs are passed on to consumers via levies on carriers, and that would also reduce, giving a net benefit to consumers overall.
So in your, you were saying that New Zealand has got a particularly good operation in this respect. So do you see that, excuse me, are there models or examples like New Zealand that we could actually use so that there would be some sort of quick and expedient way to actually start to adopt some of these principles? Because, I mean, obviously, it's no secret the government's got a serious deregulation agenda, and that seems your recommendation that you've made here seems to go to the very heart of the opportunity to actually start to get a level of unnecessary regulation out of this space. I mean, are there good examples elsewhere in the world that you could look at and say, well, yeah, if you undertook a model similar to that, then you could achieve some of the outcomes that you're seeking to in this space?
Well, Senator, most of the it's unfortunate that the more restricted often the market, the more regulation you need to make it operate in a fair way. And the report that was released this week by the government, it suggests that if you actually allow more competition, then that itself can lead to less need for regulation, because the market itself will operate more efficiently. And it's through that process that we would see the major benefit from reduced regulation occurring. That sort of takes me on to my... I'm from the country, and often when you look at these sorts of projects, and there's no question. I mean, when you cost benefit analysis, you
that's exactly what it is, and you've come up with a recommendation that maximises the return for the government and Australia. How...
Excuse me, Senator, we actually haven't recommended anything. We've just reported...
You've made a lot of recommendations.
Yes, but in the benefit cost analysis, we've just reported the facts.
Yes, of course.
And,
sure.
Until that study was done, we didn't know what the results would actually turn out to be.
But in some of the figures that you've come up with...
you mentioned working backwards before.
Yeah. Your $16 billion, net benefit. You make the comment that the issue with regional and remote areas is inherently complex and expensive. Where do you see the universal sort of service obligation in relation to equity for rural and regional Australia sitting in your sort of manifestations in coming up with this? I mean, I sort of think, there are always going to be people inherently in Australia that are going to be extraordinarily expensive to be able to service. There's never going to be a positive outcome to a cost-benefit analysis on providing them with this service. I mean, how do we manage that in the context of a great big country with only a few people, as opposed to the population centres of Sydney and Melbourne, which obviously can get a very easy economic argument stacked?
Senator, what we do recommend in that respect, and it is a recommendation that we make, is that there be greater legislative clarity about the universal service obligation that applies to very high-speed broadband services. So at the moment, the way the legislation works is that whilst there is an obligation in respect of really the standard telephony service, there isn't a clearly spelt out legislative obligation for very high-speed broadband. So we recommend that the policy goal be made more explicit in legislation, which would really provide a bit more of a framework for ongoing decisions, including decisions that ultimately must be made by the regulator in terms of, for instance, the pricing of services, and equally and closely associated with that there be clarity in the legislation about infrastructure provider of last resort obligations, so that it's clear both what must be provided and ultimately who has to be responsible for providing it. And we don't, at the moment, have those in legislation, and it's desirable that that be made more explicit in the legislative framework. Associated with that, we also recommend that there be transparency in respect of the costs of meeting the universal service obligation, and that a broad framework be developed over time for ensuring the financial sustainability of those costs. And we set out ultimately a range of ways in which, and it will take time, in which that explicit framework can be developed. Perhaps a crucial point to make in this respect, which builds really off your initial observation, is that on all the data available, the costs involved in providing service in regional areas are high, just as are the costs of this project in total. So this is a high-cost exercise, and particularly costly, obviously, once you get to areas of sparse population density and very large distances, often in fairly hostile environments in which to provide service. And as a result, we emphasise the need to ensure that there are incentives in place so that those costs are properly managed over time, in such a way that taxpayers who are bearing the bulk of the risk associated with this venture can be confident that they'll receive value for money, and that consumers in those areas and consumers of these services as a whole can also be confident of the services they will provide, they will receive, the affordability of those services and their financial sustainability. I don't know, my colleague would like to add to that.
And just finally, I mean, you refer to an infrastructure provider of last resort. Do you also, I mean, how does that translate into terms of the actual service provision once the infrastructure's there? I mean, where do you see the service provider of last resort sitting?
Well, there is already a requirement that Telstra has taken on under the definitive agreements that are put in place under the previous government, which makes it the retail provider of last resort for at least the next 20 years, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Now, I was wondering if you could help me, following on from our earlier discussion. Could we go to page 44 of the CBA? And now I'm looking at table 4.2. And I think this chapter is called the scenarios evaluated. And it looks to me like you're describing the main 4 scenarios used in the analysis. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, that's correct. They're the 4 that have been analysed, Senator.
So what's a rollout finalised date on FTTP scenario?
Is 2024 there?
Yeah. I'm confused. You've stated categorically
we will take your point on notice and get back to you, because we really have to look into the spreadsheets. But what I can assure you is that we did not alter the timings relative to the data we received from the strategic review.
So just so that...
But we will take that on notice and get back to you.
So just so that we're clear, so that Hansard can be clear, the graph looks like, notwithstanding you're saying maybe it's confusion about the data points, but my look at it said 2024. I took you on face value that...
Yes, yes.
When you denied that and said you never changed the end date.
We didn't change the deployment schedules relative to those we received.
But you agree that this is a table that looks at the 4 main scenarios, not the sensitivity analysis. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So this isn't a representation of sensitivity. We agreed on that. So this is your 4 main scenarios, and the table represents what the graph represents, which is that your end date for FTTP is 2024. Now, I'm happy to give us another submission and explain what's happened, but I just want to be clear so that we're under no misunderstanding here.
As I say, Senator, we will take that on notice and get back to you.
And could I thank Mr Mack for finding that? Because that does call into question quite a few things that we've had a discussion about, and we may have to revisit around your assumptions and where you got to. I mean, Mr Pearce was very clear we didn't push it back. You've been very clear we didn't push it back.
No,
but if you did push it back, then there is a whole range of other questions that flow from that, which I would have asked today if you'd have gone, 2024, but I'm not going to be able to ask today until after I see your response to this. That fair? Makes sense?
Well, quite happy for you to ask those questions. We'll take them on notice and get back to you.
I love the element of surprise. It's much more fun.
Well, but then you have to be ready for us to say we will take those questions on notice too, whereas if you ask them now, we'll get back to you at one time.
The great part of sitting on this side of the table is I get to ask the questions when I want, how I want. You answer them any way you want, but I get to ask them the way I want. Now, I wanted to move on to costs. I'd like to start with your OPEX assumptions. You make the point on page 141 that the single largest proportion of OPEX is accounted for by the payments to Telstra. That's correct?
Yes.
You say that these payments were held roughly constant between the MTM and FTTP scenarios.
Yes.
Due to the financial commitments set out in the DAs.
Yes.
Now, what does that mean exactly? Why roughly constant? What have you done there? Is there timing considerations? I'm just trying to understand what you mean there.
Well, Senator, just to be clear, payments to Telstra are treated as transfers in the cost-benefit analysis. Mm-hmm. So the transfers themselves do not enter into the cost-benefit analysis. There were some minor changes, if my recollection is correct, in those payments that were in the spreadsheets that we received from NBN Co. And it's in that sense that they were roughly constant. But for our purpose, transfers themselves do not affect the cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, thank you for that. On indirect operating costs on page 138, you state and I quote, corporate overhead assumptions in the strategic review model were largely set at the levels previously adopted in the corporate plan and were modelled on an FTTP scenario. The panel has concluded that it is appropriate to conduct a sensitivity in which indirect costs vary between technology scenarios according to the level of accumulated CapEx.
Yes.
So does this mean that indirect OPEX is higher for a network with greater CapEx in the CBA? I'm just trying to actually understand what you meant by that.
Yes, essentially what we do in this analysis is use cost factor approach, which is the approach used by the ACCC in its cost modelling. And so in a cost factor approach, indirects are modelled essentially as a proportion of accumulated capital costs.
Yep. So which scenario has the greater CapEx?
Well, it varies over time because MTM is deployed sooner.
Which scenario has the greatest CapEx?
And FTTP is deployed more slowly, but the CapEx costs of FTTP are significantly higher in present value terms.
So just by adopting the assumption that FTTP, because it's got a greater CapEx, you actually are then able to just ignore the actual real world, which is what economists do all the time. I tragically spent some time at university studying these issues. So even if it's costs less to maintain, less to power, we just base it entirely on a assumption that because it's got a bigger CapEx, it's got a bigger OPEX.
No, this is indirect operating costs. Yeah. Indirect operating costs are a rather small component of costs, but the essence of those is that the way they are typically modelled in forward-looking cost modelling by the ACCC is as a cost factor. We use and compare cost factors with the estimates that came from the strategic review. The strategic review, as it notes, did not attempt to carefully assess the level of indirect operating costs. We did.
I've no doubt it didn't, but your careful assessment is to look at OPEX and say, well, we've got bigger CapEx.
No.
So therefore it must be bigger.
That is quite incorrect, Senator, because...
That's exactly what you said, but please re-explain it to me. I'm slow
because OPEX, in terms of the direct OPEX, is modelled directly. It's the indirects that are either modelled as a constant, which is essentially what is done in the strategic review, or as a cost factor, which is the approach that we've adopted.
So your assumption that you've made increases the level of indirect operating expenditure for FTP scenario relative to the MTM.
But this is in the sensitivity. Senator, if you read the last paragraph, the last sentence of the paragraph that you're referring to, it is surely quite clear what is involved.
I'm just asking you to confirm.
Well, let me confirm that the last sentence says what the last sentence says, which is that...
Help read it out for everybody who doesn't have it in front of them.
Which is that the panel has concluded it is appropriate to conduct a sensitivity in which indirect costs vary between technology scenarios according to the level of accumulated capex.
I read that out myself at the beginning of my questions. Now, you also appear to have made 3 other important OPEX assumptions. The first is to give NBN Co a volume discount for power costs it will incur in running the nodes. Am I correct that this assumption reduces the OPEX of MTM?
Yes.
Now, you're familiar with how long it took to just get a electricity company agreement for one node in Epping? Or we don't worry about the real world?
No, but we did look at what experience internationally was in this respect, and experience internationally is that large telcos that are deploying these nodes do get volume discounts.
And Senator, the figures that we understand were originally used were just taken from a supplier's website.
Exactly.
Oh, I've no doubt of the shoddy work conducted by the strategic review. I have no doubt about that. Oh dear. Now, I just want to go back to that point we were just discussing. Appendix F, page 138, is where you make this assumption about the indirect OPEX. Okay, so just to confirm, it's your assumption. We haven't made it up. I've quoted you accurately. You've quoted yourself accurately.
Yes.
Okay, good. The second assumption you've made is to increase the OPEX of the FTTP scenario by assuming there is a lower differential in the cost of fixing faults. Is that correct?
Yes, there was a peculiarity in the spreadsheets where the truck roll time for a particular kind of operation that was associated with FTTP was simply incompatible with truck rolls occurring, and we corrected that error.
Expert on truck rolls, are you?
We consulted, obviously, before we did that.
So you've increased the OPEX from the
assuming that
the
trucks,
strategic plan.
from assuming that that the trucks have to roll for a distance of a few hundred metres to something that seems slightly more plausible.
So did the expert panel undertake any direct investigation of the current state of Telstra's copper network and the fact that the misguided decision to gel-fill joints has created a progressive degradation in the sheathing of cables, necessitating increasing numbers of cable faults to be rectified by replacing damaged sections of the cable? Did you look at that at all? What assumptions did you make about the state of the copper network before you decided to increase the costs of on an assumption about a truck roll for the FTTP?
So, Senator, the issue of the state of the copper network was examined in the strategic review, and the strategic review came to what it thought was a plausible assessment of the state of the copper network.
So they were capable of assessing a network they hadn't seen accurately, in your view, but they weren't capable of assessing a network in which they've got 240,000 existing customers, albeit in the very early stages. And you felt that they'd made incorrect assumptions. So they'd got it right on a network they'd never seen, but they've seen a bit of a network, albeit early. I'll grant you that qualification, but they got that part wrong.
Well, the reality of it is that the assumption they had made with respect to truck rolls was, we believe, and this was certainly our understanding of it,
But
an
they
error.
were dead right on the state of the copper
An error.
network.
As regards the state of the copper network, their assessment, I think, was a reasonable assessment and was consistent with all the information that's available about the state of the copper network, including the very substantial investment that has been made in rehabilitating the copper network.
Oh, sorry,
since
I thought you were no longer on
access.
Telstra's payroll, but perhaps you are.
No more than you are,
Telstra's copper
Senator.
network.
No more than you are. But what I can assure you is that since 1999 and the CAN plan in 1999, as the ACCC itself has indicated, very significant investment has been made in the copper network.
Okay, so the third assumption you appear to have made is to reduce the OPEX cost increase arising from the complexity that NBN Co will face having to operate 3 and possibly 4 fixed line networks instead of just 1 under the FTTP scenario. So the strategic plan put in a cost for running 3 or 4 networks, and you said that's too much.
Sorry, Senator, what we did was we concluded it would be appropriate to run a sensitivity in which the project management and design costs were reduced for the MTM scenario, and that really reflects international experience in the sense that the complexity of managing the HFC upgrade is quite low. Much more documentation is available in respect of the copper network and of what needs to be done to deploy nodes than is the case for FTTP. And so while, yes, there is some additional complexity in having a mix of technologies rather than a single technology, there are also very substantial cost reductions that come from the fact that the largest part of the costs of the copper and cable networks are already sunk. As a result, we ran a sensitivity that took that into account.
To the uninitiated over on this side, it looks like you've based the cost of project management and decision against the level of accumulated CapEx. That's how it looks to it, without that somewhat esoteric explanation. But that's what you've done.
That's right. So we use the cost factors that are typically used by regulators in that respect.
Great. So when we
including
need to
the
reduce,
ACCC.
when we need to reduce MTM's costs, we'll go for the ACCC's
But only
models.
for the sensitivity analysis, Senator, not for the main reporting figures.
So the net result of the assumption is to reduce project management and design costs for MTM. And you say only in the sensitivity analysis, not in the main analysis.
That's correct.
And you said that a little earlier about something else too, but we'll keep going. So let me get this straight. You revised upwards the strategic review's own assumptions about the cost of rectifying faults on a brand new fibre network, while lowering costs NBN Co will face operating 3 or 4 fixed line networks rather than 1.
For the sensitivity analysis.
Of course. Now, the strategic review states on page 83, and I quote, operating costs in network operations are usually expected to increase in order to support a more complex technology environment. However, NBN Co's level of operating expenditure in the corporate plan is significant. Benchmarks with comparable multi-network wholesale telecommunications companies suggest there is substantial cost reduction potential in both ongoing operating and overhead costs for NBN Co. The strategic review therefore assesses that cost increases due to increased complexity can be more than offset by potential cost reductions. In other words, the strategic review has already assumed that higher corporate overheads for the MTM due to complexity will be offset by cost reductions, and you've lowered them further.
But all we're doing, Senator, is just seeing how sensitive results are if you make some variations to these parameter values. That's simply all we're doing. And if the person reading the report can make their own decision on what they think is appropriate. And
we're getting the picture. We just keep revising certain numbers down. We're getting that picture. Now, I just want to go back again. The assumptions we were talking about before are key assumptions for reviewing NBN Co's cost model set out on page 138 and displayed in the cost tables 5.4, 5.5 on pages 56 and 57. They're not sensitivities. I'm working off your cost model, not your sensitivity analysis model. So maybe I'm just reading it completely wrong. So I'm offering you again the opportunity to confirm that the numbers I've been talking about, referring to, are straight out of this table, which are not your sensitivity tables. But please, if I'm reading it wrong, just tell me.
Yeah, I think you are, in the sense that what we do make some adjustments that I've referred to for OPEX and CAPEX, in the base case, but the specific ones that you're referring to were done as sensitivities.
So tables 5.4, 5.5.
I mean, essentially what happens is we make the adjustments that you can see by comparing 5.4 and 5.5, okay? And we then look at whether those adjustments make a difference to our results.
So I'm looking at.
So we run
I'm looking at
two
your adjustments.
scenarios. We run the NBN co assumptions and we run the panel assumptions.
And so which ones should I be looking at? Tell me which page, 56, 57, table 5.4 or 5.5? Which is the one I should be looking at, just so there is no confusion?
Well, Senator, obviously we think the panel's assumptions are the appropriate ones on which to draw the primary conclusions. But there's nothing being hidden here. If people don't like the assumptions that we've taken and prefer NBN codes, by all means.
And we've also modelled those fully.
So I just want to be very clear that costs in tables 5.4 and 5.5 are the results of the panel's review of NBN co cost models. That's
Yes,
what
that's
those
correct.
tables represent.
Yes.
Okay.
Table 5.5 is the original cost model results.
No.
Not
I'm
the
just
result
trying to
of
be
a review.
completely clear.
Yes.
So that, we're not working off the wrong pages. So the nominal amounts for your OPEX review are redacted, but tables 5.4 and 5.5, as we're discussing, provide the present value calculations. So I'd like to go through the results of your review process. Table 5.5 sets out the present value numbers you calculated using NBN co's cost models, correct? Mr. Pearson.
correct, Senator.
A nod doesn't get recorded. And table 5.4 sets out the changes to these numbers you made as a result of your review process, correct?
They show the net results of the changes, correct?
They show the net present value
In
associated.
net present value
Yes.
changes.
Yeah. That's what I think I described it. The present value calculations, net
Yes.
present value calculations.
Yes.
So just confirming that the present value costs in these tables cover the entire evaluation period out to 2040 for both scenarios.
Yes, that's correct.
That's correct, yeah.
Slide 1. Yep, slide 1. Can I just check, because this is one thing that has confused me. In your MTM model, have you factored in any upgrade to FTTP in the future in your modelling?
Well, we have a very significant component of FTTP in the MTN.
Yeah, no, but to move beyond FTTN or even HFC or...
No.
So there's you've got no cost in there for... If someone suddenly decides data growth is greater than Robert Kenny, thinks we need to upgrade, there's no cost in there.
No, that's not quite right.
No, so I'm trying to understand it.
Yeah,
so
no,
between now and 2040, have you put in upgrade costs to fibre to the premise?
No. So essentially what happens is we deploy MTM and MTM remains in place over the modelling period. We then look at a scenario in which you accelerate a transition to FTTP, and that is broadly set out in our discussion of sensitivities as a sensitivity where willingness to pay rises more rapidly than we expect in the base case.
Yeah. But in your main model, it's not.
Exactly.
It is in one of your sensitivity analysis, is it? Should
Yes.
be. But in the main case, there is no upgrade costs
No.
to FTTP. Thank you. Okay. Now, could I get the slide up? Thank you. Now, table 5.5 sets out that for the MTM scenario, the NBN co model assumed about $1.7 billion for fixed line OPEX. Is that correct?
Well, I think you're reading off table
5.5.
5.5.
Yep. 1.7 fixed line OPEX. Just confirming it's up there in.
For MTM?
Yeah, it's right there on the if you look up to the left.
56. Yes.
Or right in your case.
Yep.
Okay. And the panel has assumed about 1.9 billion. That's your number.
1.9 is in the table. Yes, Senator.
Yeah. 0.5 and 1.4.
In net present value terms?
In net present value terms, 0.9. So it's a 180% increase.
Sorry, 180%.
Yeah.
1.9 compared with 1.7.
Sorry. You've got a 12% increase in fixed line OPEX for MTM and a 180% increase for FTTP.
Well,
The extra bits are just the mathematical calculations based on those numbers.
yes, the OPEX rises from 0.5 to 1.4. Yes, that's correct.
Which is a 180% increase. So for MTM, fixed line OPEX, after you've adjusted for your assumptions, is a 12% increase in fixed line OPEX,
correct.
but for FTTP, fixed line OPEX rises 180%. So table.
So what's the point, Senator?
No, I'm just wanting to agree that those numbers are correct.
They are confirmed with the table of the costs that are presented here, then they're correct.
An increase. Okay, so you've increased the fixed line OPEX of FTTP by 180% compared to a 12% increase in MTM. That's just what those figures show. So I want to look at CapEx then.
Senator, we made adjustments where we thought it appropriate. If we didn't think it appropriate, we didn't make adjustments.
You can stand by the numbers which you're doing. I'm just demonstrating what they represent. So looking at
I think
CapEx,
we actually have a table.
what are the panel's key assumptions here in regard to the NBN cost models you inherited? Has CapEx for FTTP scenario increased as a result of your assumptions about the rollout end date? Well, again, that goes to this question of whether or not you've actually increased the rollout end date.
But we have a table that just sets all that out. Yeah, we have chart 5.2, Senator, sets out the information that you are looking at, and table 5.1 gives exactly that information. I don't see what.
I'm just quoting your own. I'm just getting you to confirm on the record.
No, Senator, we show here that the difference in costs between for FTTP between NBN co's assumptions and panel assumptions is that the costs of FTTP scenario rise from 30.6 billion in present value terms to 35.3 billion.
No, do you mind if I ask questions and you can respond to them rather than just reading out things from the paper?
Well, I'm just trying to ensure that you're aware of the fact that we have provided exactly the information that you're now setting up as if it were a surprise.
I've just consolidated it into one place, that's all. That's all I've really done.
No,
it's scattered in a few different places.
One place in table 5.1.
So just going back to my question, the nominal amounts for your CapEx review are redacted, but table 5.5 sets out that for the MTM scenario, the NBN co model assumed about 7.5 billion present value for fixed line CapEx, that's up there, 7.5, and the panel has decided it should have been 8.4. That's an increase of about 900 million in net present value terms, or about 12% on the MTM model. And you set out for the FTTP scenario, NBN model assumed 16 billion NPV up there on the table, and the panel has assumed 19.8 billion. That's a 24% increase in CapEx from the strategic plan prepared by Mr. Rousselot. So you've increased the fixed line CapEx of FTTP scenario by double in the amount that you've increased your MTM scenario in percentage terms. It's just a statement of what's on the chart.
Yes, and that's exactly.
So then I wanted to move into the totals. When you make all of those assumptions, then I want to move into the totals. So you set out both of them. you assume 23.9 there for the multi-technology mix,
Yes.
billion. And in table 5.4, the
No,
table
we
has
don't.
assumed...
NBN assumes 23.9.
Yeah, sorry. And in table
We
5.4, the
assume
panel,
24.9.
24.9 for the MTM, an increase of $1 billion or 4.2%.
Correct.
Table 5.5, NBN model 30.6 billion. Your panel, your table 5.4 assumes 35.3 billion, an increase of 4.7 or 15.4% increase in the net present value. Now, table 5.5 and the text of page 52 sets out that NBN Co model assumed a difference of about 6.8 billion NPV between the FTP-TP scenario and the MTM. And the panel has increased that by 3.6 billion to 10.4. So the sum result of all your numbers gives us a cost review process to increase the cost of FTTP scenario relative to the MTM scenario in present value terms by about 53%. And then I come back to my question, are you aware that Melton 10 showed a 60% reduction in cost and 50% reduction in time?
And it may well be, Senator, that the trial of fibre to the node that Telstra is currently undertaking might show that its costs are 60% lower than's been assumed in the Model 2. We don't know.
It might fly to the moon too. I'm just looking at your increases
all you seem to be
when the
doing
real world is actually going in the
somewhat-
opposite direction.
No, you're saying the real world is going in the opposite direction. All you're really doing is repeating what is at page 52 of our report, carefully spelt out what the variances are, why we've made those variances, why those variances were accepted by the panel as a whole, and what the implications of those variances are. We then, in the sensitivity testing, look at whether not undertaking or not making any of those variances would alter our results, and it is clear from the sensitivity testing that even had we used exactly the numbers that came from NBN Co, our results would have been the same.
No, I'm just drawing out from your report, and one of the things these Senate committee hearings does is actually look at the evidence and seek explanation of it. And you've been giving an explanation of the evidence in your report, a perfectly normal process. Don't need to be so defensive. The figures do speak for themselves.
They do too, Senator.
And that's why we put the figures, Senator, with all respect,
when the real world arrives, don't worry.
That's why we discussed exactly those figures at considerable length.
It's pretty clear
on page
that
52.
one set of numbers are pretty pumped and one set are pretty flat. No question about that. I think Mr Pearce described that as more conservative assumptions at the beginning of the day, but just wanted to draw out those conservative assumptions and see where they got us. One scenario, very pumped up costs. Now, I just wanted to confirm, because we have to close in a moment. Now, you've never handed out, Professor Ergas, for Senator Smith, have you, in an election how to vote cards?
I'm sorry?
You've never handed out how to vote cards for Senator Smith, have you, from the Liberal Party?
Senator Smith?
Senator Smith, he was the guy from Optus over there before. He's gone now.
Senator Conroy.
No, Elaine, take a second.
I'm sorry, I don't.
You've never handed out how to vote cards in an election campaign on election day for Senator Smith or Senator Rushworth or Senator Bernardi, have you? Ruston, sorry.
I'm afraid I don't believe I have, but
No,
I would have been...
You have handed out for Senator Giselle.
Like you, Senator Conroy, I participate in the democratic process, and having done so
It's a
with
wonderful experience.
pride,
I encourage everyone to do it, but just for accuracy, I wanted to make sure.
Look at evidence with a clear mind, and I try to assess it rigorously.
No, I appreciate that, but I just wanted to confirm that you didn't have any conflict undeclared with the three Liberal senators here, but if Senator Geldo was still on the committee, which he was, you would have possibly had a conflict of interest given you'd handed out how to vote cards for him a year or two ago.
Senator Conroy, I assume I'm in exactly the same position in that respect.
Oh, I've never handed out for Senator
that you
Bernardi
and
either.
many other people are, that we participate in the democratic process,
wonderful
but
thing.
We've done so, and having done so, we look at evidence with a
You've
clear
done a
mind
cost-benefit
and as
analysis on
rigorously as
the
possible.
cost of your credibility as an independent witness if you hand out for the Liberal Party. Yeah, that's a good cost-benefit analysis.
Sorry, so what is the credibility of members of this review that you're undertaking if you have handed out how-to-vote cards opposing the revised approach to the NBN?
Yeah, but you got the committee to hire every single member of your former staff to do your analysis.
Oh, well, Senator.
Oh, well, just an accident, coincidence. They were the experts in the field,
Senator,
we know.
My advice on that would be that is not a particularly fertile ground for this
Just
sort
a fact.
of discussion.
It's not a question of fertile ground, it's just a fact.
You need to wrap things up.
I will,
Senator
and
Conroy.
I can only confirm that Justice Goldberg was right. But I did want to thank a few people who've been listening and participating and helping along the way. The great Joel Arkvark, Glenn Hope, Mr Max, Sir Talgater, Annie Pink, Helpman, Sir Xenakos, CW, Dazed and Confused, UTC, Dijos and the Earl of Conrovia, and I've probably missed quite a few of you, but thank you for your help during the course of the day. That's the Whirlpool crowd who have more facts than all 5 of us combined at their fingertips.
And a clear willingness to let people know who they are.
The
To
facts
participate in the democratic process under their own names.
The facts that they provide are sourced to documents, unlike you
Senator,
trying to pretend you didn't hire every member of your failed...
All you have done in these proceedings is quote
Other than you trying
from
to
our
hide the fact...
documents.
Senator Conroy, I'm going to draw these proceedings
You're trying to hide the
close.
fact that you hired every
Senator
failed member
Conroy.
of your failed company to do the legwork in this review.
Oh, Senator, come on.
That's just the truth. It's not,
Senator, come on.
Senator Conroy, I'd like to thank our witnesses for appearing today. This concludes today's public hearing. I think I do need a motion to accept the documents, the letter tabled earlier today, so resolved. And we have resolved as a committee that any questions taken on notice, the answers will need to be provided to the committee by the 31st of October 2014. Thank you once again. I declare this hearing adjourned.